one-point perspective scenes can visually be very dramatic to look at, and therefore they're a great drawing subject. However, despite the fact that they're one-point perspective, and you'd think that one would have to be easier than two or three, in lots of ways, one-point perspective, where all the horizontal lines end up merging in virtually a single point in the distance, can actually be very challenging to draw, particularly when we're looking up the street, which is a fairly common streetscape viewpoint, or very close to looking up the street. What we're seeing is along the front of all of the building fronts. And so we get a severely foreshortened view. Because the building's moving away so dramatically, so quickly, it shrinks in height at top and bottom very rapidly as it moves along the street. But it also compresses visually in its width, very much so as it moves along the street. And it gets to the point where trying to draw the individual buildings is actually the big mistake that people make. Because we end up with so little width that we just can't, with all the limitations of a pen line thickness, we just can't draw the detail. And so this is where, again, this principle of trying to visualize and then draw the effect of the detail comes in strongly. Now, you'll see me using my pen to check and to measure the angles. What I like to do is to put a dot where I think the end of the line's going to be, and then I check that angle, and then I compare that angle with what the real angle is. And that gives me a sense of judgment of my perception, if you like, of how accurately I can observe and then work out where that angle's going to end up. It's handy to know when there are times when we can't do that, or for some reason we don't want to. And it's good to know whether I tend to make my angles a bit too steep or a bit too shallow. It's handy to know that, because then we know what we're watching out for. We know what to be suspicious of with our lines. And particularly in a streetscape such as this, as the lines get higher and higher, the angle becomes more and more considerable. And not just here where it's closer to us, but as we move further along the street, and there are a couple of buildings that are actually higher, or parts of the buildings are higher than what we have here on the left. And that means that the angles become even steeper. So how I think when it comes to a one-point perspective streetscape is, with the first maybe third or half of the streetscape, I'm basically trying to draw what I can see. So this grey building with the two arched windows, fairly wide arched windows, and the door, basically takes up more than half the width, in fact. And so that just shows how compressed visually the rest of the street is. And then the next building takes up probably a third of what's left. So what I'm looking at in particular are shadows and indents. I mean, generally the shadows are caused by indents, by something at least that's interrupting the smooth, plain surface of the facade. And the other place we have to pay particular attention to is ground level. Have to try really hard not to draw a straight line in ink at the angle approximately of the base of all these buildings. Because once we draw that line there, we can't remove it. And yet it's not what we see. It's not what we see. We don't see a straight line. There are all sorts of ins and outs, from pilasters and decorative elements, drainage pipes, doorways, windows even. And so we don't want a long straight line. We want an edge surface that reflects the ins and outs at ground level. And the fact that at ground level also, there's often little bits of rock and grit and rubble that gets blown up against the bottom of the building, which visually also disturbs the any appearance of a smooth line that might have been there. So when we have a streetscape such as this, important that we firstly, except for the closest one or two buildings, we don't try and draw the buildings, but we try and spot the effect and draw the effect. There's going to be a lot of vertical lines, but not necessarily vertical from top to bottom of the building. Now, this is where now, if we think of these facades as being wedge-shaped patterns, we need to look to see what the patterns are. Now, any horizontal lines are going to fit the perspective angles of the street. So we need to make sure that that happens in our drawings. But more so, the vertical lines need to stop and start in line with what's happening on the facade, even if we can't actually work that out. So this is where we can draw what we see in a simplified way without even having to know what it is. Just a little bit of shadow there. This whole facade, of course, is in shade. You can see that, and it's casting a shadow onto the street. But I'm not going to worry about trying to create the shade effect, but I do put the shadow on the footpath at the end. So now we've got this closest building done, and we start to move down. And this is where now we have to really pick up the pace of drawing less of what we see and more of, you could almost say, what we feel. And I have switched from a 0.3 millimeter pen to a 0.1 millimeter pen, which is just going to help me create lighter, thinner lines for the buildings further back up the street. And that's going to help create the effect of distance, of depth of plane. When we look right along a street, we have a very long depth of plane. And so we want to try and take full advantage of that depth, that distance, which is always a very helpful visual effect. Creates interest, invites the person looking at our drawing to enter into it, to travel up it and through it, and to linger and to explore. So we want to create a sense of this is a long street that we could walk along, at least with our eyes. And we also have to make sure we bring these lines together well, that the angle is coming towards a point somewhere in the distance. Now, lines aren't necessarily rigidly in a straight line in a perspective drawing such as this. Sometimes further along the street, where it's not super obvious, but part of one of the buildings might come forward slightly, and that can almost create a sort of slightly bowed effect in the perspective angle. So we just need to draw what we see. And now there's this little decorative tower on the top that has a very light look, a very light feel, so I want to capture that myself in the tower. And then the challenge will be this little curved roofing element, which, because we're looking up at it, isn't going to come to the corners. It's going to be hidden by the underside of our view. So again, we want to observe that and capture that. So now it really is becoming very abstract. So it's lots of vertical lines that to some degree for each building seem to get thinner or closer together as they move from the left to right. And then paying attention to any decorative parts of the building that protrude in a horizontal line along the facade, that they follow the perspective angles. And so we're not thinking really of buildings at all. We're not even thinking of shapes because they're all too small and too thin. The important thing is to get the angle and to have the lines credibly close together. To not let any building suddenly stretch out unreasonably far, because that will start to look as though it's not not fitting in properly. We really don't want to be drawn to see any individual building up the far end of the street. We just want to have a sense that they're there stretching off. And so, again, we're still working on not having a straight line down the bottom, often lots of little horizontal lines to indicate a step in to a shop area, or at least a slight step in the facade. They don't even have to line up with vertical lines. We're not, in fact, trying to draw exactly. When we try to draw the effect of the detail, not the detail, it's often very important not to be too precise, because once we start being precise, the eye of the observer starts to see the scene differently, with a different mindset of now looking for the detail, and they're going to find it wanting, because we just can't possibly draw that in this way, in this scale. But if we create the effect, then the viewer's brain sits back a little bit and sees the overall scene and the overall objects, and is quite content with our capture of that visual effect. So now I do the worst car I've done for a very long time. I'm not sure that anyone could know what that was. However, fortunately it's in the distance, and hopefully the fact that it's sitting in the street just tips recognition into its favour. And there is a tree, that big tree that comes out over the footpath quite some distance down the street. This is in a New South Wales regional town called Goulburn. And some sort of, I think some sort of electric meter, fuse box thing sitting at the edge of the footpath that is good to draw in, while it doesn't, in a way, add a great sense of architecture or elegance to the street. What it does do is that it comes very close to us. So it makes the street feel even longer, because we start viewing the street right in front, right at our feet, and then it stretches back. Otherwise, we can start to enter the scene a bit further back, and we just lose a little bit of the sense of the length of it. And so now I'm just going to do some hatching lines for the shadow of the facade going over the road. Now, I'm still using my 0.1mm pen. I'll use that for all of the facade, but you'll see me for all of the shadow, but you'll see me work more lines over the closer section. I'm just going to make the shadow darker the closer to us it becomes, because that's the way it works in life. Values, such as shadows, dark values, such as shadows, become less dark as they move into the distance. Now that's, I think, my understanding is due to an atmospheric effect, but it's that effect of reality that we want to capture in our drawing. And just a few hatch lines to not exaggerate, but emphasize the sense of depth in this closest facade, just to help with the sense of 3 dimensions. And again, emphasizing some shadows in that next building. And now a little more hatching for the shadow. It's good not to let shadows become too even, because in life, again, there is slight variation because of unevenness in the ground, or sometimes bouncing shadows or bouncing light. We want to avoid what can be monotonous darkness. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. 1-point perspective street facades are, I think, visually very dramatic to see and great to draw. We just have to learn to let go of the detail and focus on the essential effect of the perspective and the angle, and work at capturing that. And then they're a lot of fun, and in many ways, fairly simple. But hey, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.